The flight was routine, at least that was how it began. Passengers walked down the narrow aisle, searching for their seats, stowing away their bags, and settling in with the quiet patience that every traveler learns after long hours in airports. She was among them, a quiet figure with nothing unusual to mark her presence. Just another passenger, or so it seemed. She sat near the window, fastening her belt and folding her hands neatly in her lap. Her expression was calm, almost detached, as though she had done this countless times before. The cabin lights dimmed slightly and the low hum of the engines filled the air. The plane began its slow roll onto the runway, gathering speed until the city below fell away and only clouds stretched around them. For most people, this was the familiar rhythm of travel. Nothing more, but for her there was something heavier hidden beneath that calm. She wasn't simply traveling. She was carrying something within her that no one around her could have guessed. Not the family across the aisle, not the businessman tapping on his laptop, not the crew offering practice smiles. They all saw a quiet woman, but no one saw what she once had been. The sky outside was clear, the vast blue broken only by streaks of white vapor trails. The pilot's voice came through the intercom with practiced calm, announcing cruising altitude and expected arrival time. People relaxed into their seats, pulling out books, headphones, or simply closing their eyes. The cabin became a small floating world of strangers sharing silence. But far above, beyond the awareness of the passengers, radar screens told a different story. Fighter jets were in the sky, their sleek shapes cutting across the atmosphere. They were part of a routine patrol, invisible to those below but watchful, alert, always listening. The passengers didn't know, the crew didn't know, and even the pilot didn't mention it. But the woman near the window knew. She had felt it in the faint vibration in the air, in the way her eyes were drawn to the trails left behind high above. For a moment her calm slipped, just barely, a flicker of recognition crossing her eyes. The hours stretched on. The soft rhythm of the flight lulled many into quiet rest. A child's laughter carried from the back rows. The rustle of magazines and the clink of ice in cups echoed softly. But she stayed still, her thoughts wandering, caught between who she was now and who she had once been. She had worn a uniform once, not the pressed one of a flight attendant, but something heavier, something that bore responsibility. Her hands had once gripped controls that could change the fate of skies. Her ears had once listened for codes and signals. She had lived in the sharp world of call signs, radio chatter, and the sound of engines screaming at impossible speed. That life was behind her now, but never fully gone. When turbulence shook the plane briefly, passengers gasped and clutched their armrests. The crew moved quickly, assuring everyone that it was just rough air. The woman, however, remained unmoved. Her hand tightened on her armrest, not out of fear but out of memory. For turbulence to her was nothing compared to what she had flown through before. The moment passed, calm returned. The hum of the engines grew steady once more. Yet above them, unseen, the patrol jets had shifted. A coded signal crackled faintly through secure frequencies. The pilots were scanning, searching, watching, and when they spoke to each other, they spoke in clipped phrases, professional, measured, but then they fell into silence, because across that hidden frequency a voice had spoken, not loud, not commanding, but steady, carrying a weight of recognition that no radar could capture. It was her voice, a single call sign spoken with precision. For the passengers around her, she was still just another traveler seated quietly by the window. But for the pilots high above, it was as if the past had reached out of the clouds. They froze, their breath caught. Their instruments were alive with data, their eyes fixed on the horizon. But their ears could not ignore what they had heard. The voice carried a code, one they knew, one they respected. A code that was never supposed to come from a civilian flight. On the commercial plane, no one noticed her lips move. The quiet hum of conversation around her drowned it out. Yet in the cockpit of the F-22s, silence stretched long and heavy. The call sign was one they had heard only in training, in stories passed between pilots. It was not supposed to belong to anyone outside their world. But now it had been spoken clearly from far below. The lead pilot glanced at his wingman, both wide-eyed beneath their helmets. They said nothing, not yet, but something had shifted. The skies had been calm a moment ago. Now they held a question larger than their mission. Who was she, this passenger below, and why did she carry a name that belonged to legends? And so the flight continued, outwardly unchanged. Passengers sipped their drinks, flipped pages of books, or scrolled through glowing screens, but in the silence of the upper sky, Two pilots carried a secret that none of those inside the cabin yet knew. For them, the world had changed the moment that call sign echoed across their frequency. The moment the call sign slipped from her lips, the world above shifted. The pilots inside the F-22s held their breath. They had trained for countless scenarios, intercepts, emergencies, threats on the radar, but never for this. Never for hearing a voice that spoke with the weight of someone who had once been one of them. In the cabin of the commercial plane, no one sensed the ripple in the sky. The passengers were still lost in their quiet worlds, watching movies on small screens, sipping drinks or closing their eyes in rest. The crew moved smoothly up and down the aisle, handing out trays with practiced calm. But the woman by the window was far away from their world. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, but her mind was not on the present. It had gone back to another cockpit, another time, where her world was framed by blinking instruments, tight helmets, and the sound of engines that could shake the earth. She remembered the rush of adrenaline when her call sign had first been given to her. The pride, the responsibility, the brotherhood of voices that had once answered her in the sky. The call sign was more than a name, it was a promise. It was an identity that could not be broken even when the uniform was folded away. Even now, years later, on a simple flight between cities, it lived inside her, like a spark that could not be put out. The F-22 pilots exchanged quick looks, one tilting his head slightly, the other pressing a gloved finger against the side of his helmet. The silence in their comms was not ordinary. It was heavy, weighted. They knew that call sign. They had been taught about it in training, mentioned in stories of past missions where a single pilot had done the impossible and brought others home. For a moment, they wondered if it was a trick, an interference. But the tone of the voice had carried something no machine could fake. It had carried history, and it had carried truth back in the cabin. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds beneath them. Her eyes softened, not with sadness but with the ache of remembering. The clouds had been her battlefield once, her arena. She had trusted the skies with her life, and the skies had taken as much as they had given. The lead pilot finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "Did you hear that?" he asked. His wingman answered without hesitation. "I heard it." They did not say more. They didn't need to. Both of them knew what it meant. Both of them felt the weight of carrying a secret that no one on the ground would believe if they told. For the passengers below, hours in the air were nothing but time to pass. But for the pilots above, minutes stretched sharp and slow. Their hands stayed on the controls, their eyes never leaving their instruments, waiting, wondering if the voice would speak again. Inside the cabin, the woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting the drone of the engines wash over her. She had not meant to speak, not really. It had slipped out unplanned, the way memories sometimes rise uninvited. But she knew the consequences. If they had heard her, they would know. They would remember that her call sign was not one passed around lightly. A child in the row behind her giggled. Breaking into her thoughts, she smiled faintly, a small, almost unseen curve of her lips. It was a reminder that life had moved on, that there was more to the world than missions and skies. And yet, deep inside, she knew the sky had never truly let her go. The F-22s continued their silent watch, their sleek wings slicing the thin air. To the radar operators on the ground, it was just another patrol, but in the cockpits, tension ran like a quiet current. They carried with them the sound of a call sign that should not have been there, a voice that was not supposed to exist in their frequency. The wingman spoke softly, his tone almost respectful. "What do we do?" The leader paused before answering. "We wait." Down below, the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights, encouraging rest as the long journey stretched ahead. Passengers pulled blankets over themselves, the quiet hum of sleep beginning to fill the air. But the woman stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. She could feel them somewhere above watching. She knew pilots well enough to know they would not forget. Her mind drifted again, back to nights where missions had taken her into skies far more dangerous than this one. She remembered the feeling of steel beneath her gloves, the weight of silence before orders came, the way her breath would steady as she repeated her call sign into the dark. It had once been her shield, her anchor and her truth. Now it was a memory she had spoken into the air without thinking, and it had awakened ghosts she thought she had left behind. The passengers would never know. The crew would never guess, but high above, in the silence of the stars, two pilots carried her name like a flame, and they knew that nothing about this flight was ordinary anymore. The story of who she was had only just begun to reveal itself, and the skies themselves seemed to lean closer, waiting for what would come next. The night sky stretched endless, dotted with faint stars above the blanket of clouds. The plane moved steady through the air, carrying its passengers toward their destination. But within its cabin sat a secret none of them could see. She sat still by the window, her reflection faintly lit by the dim cabin lights. Her face was calm, but her mind was far from quiet. The call sign she had spoken was not meant to escape her lips. It was a part of her that she had locked away, a name carried only in the skies, spoken in times when life and death balanced on the edge of every heartbeat. Yet tonight the skies had taken it back. And above her, 2 fighter pilots now carried that memory like a living spark. The F-22s held their course. Their pilots had not spoken again, but the silence was not empty. It was heavy with recognition. For them, the voice below was not just another signal. It was history calling from the clouds inside the cabin. The passengers stirred as the seatbelt sign came on. The captain's voice broke the calm, announcing a change in weather ahead. Turbulence light, nothing to fear still. People shifted uncomfortably, gripping their armrests. Some muttered prayers under their breath. The woman by the window remained still, her breathing even. She had flown through storms before, storms that rattled metal until it felt ready to break. She had guided her jet through skies filled with fire, through walls of cloud that swallowed sound itself. Compared to those moments, this turbulence was gentle, almost kind. Her eyes closed briefly, and in the darkness behind her lids she was no longer a passenger. She was once again in the seat of her jet, helmet tight, visor glowing with symbols and numbers. The call sign rang in her ears as clearly as it had years ago. She could almost feel the pressure of the controls beneath her hands, the raw power of engines behind her. She opened her eyes again, and the hum of the passenger plane brought her back. A soft sigh escaped her lips, not of regret but of longing. The skies had shaped her life, and though she now lived among civilians, their rhythms and routines often felt foreign for her. The true language of the world had always been spoken in radio codes, in call signs, and in silence broken by trust between pilots above. The lead F-22 pilot adjusted his course slightly. His instruments showed the civilian plane far below. He kept one eye on it, unable to let go of what he had heard. His wingman spoke finally. If that was really her, what does it mean? The leader hesitated. It means legends don't always stay gone. The cabin lights flickered briefly as the turbulence grew. Gasps rose from the passengers. A baby cried softly. The crew moved quickly to reassure everyone, their voices calm, their movements smooth. But the woman's attention wasn't on them. Her gaze was locked outside into the storm clouds ahead. Flashes of lightning lit the night, carving the clouds into sharp shapes. To her the storm was familiar, almost welcoming. She remembered flying missions through weather far worse. Guided only by instinct and trust in her training, her lips moved silently, not in fear but in habit. Words she had spoken countless times before. Steadying herself and her crew, the call sign returned to her mouth, a whisper against the roar of the engines. She hadn't realized she had spoken again until she caught her own breath. Somewhere high above, the comms of the F-22s came alive once more. Both pilots stiffened. The voice was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. The wingman muttered under his breath, "It's her again." The leader didn't reply, but his grip on the throttle tightened. Every story they had ever heard about her rushed back at once. The impossible missions, the flights no one else had survived, the way her name was spoken in their training rooms, always with respect, always with disbelief that one person could do so much, and now, that same voice was speaking from a plane filled with unsuspecting civilians. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt another jolt as the plane rocked harder. Drinks spilled, bags rattled in overhead bins. Fear began to creep into faces, but the woman remained calm. Her calmness was so steady it drew the eyes of a passenger sitting across the aisle. He stared at her, wondering why she wasn't afraid when everyone else seemed uneasy. She met his gaze briefly and gave the faintest nod, as if silently telling him it would be all right, and somehow he believed her. The storm deepened, lightning flashing brighter. The captain's voice returned, assuring everyone they were in no danger. But even his tone carried tension. The woman knew it too. She could feel the strain of the engines against the air. She could hear the hidden language of turbulence, the rhythm of the sky speaking to her once again. Above, the F-22s kept their silent watch. For them, this was no longer just routine. It was a moment that connected past and present, a reminder that legends sometimes sit quietly among ordinary people, unseen, unknown until the sky itself calls them back. The woman's hand rested against the glass of the window. Her eyes followed the storm, unflinching. She had once been more than just a passenger, and tonight the sky seemed unwilling to let her forget, and though no one else inside the cabin could hear it, the heavens above had already begun to whisper her story once more. The storm pressed harder against the plane, shaking it as though the sky itself was testing its strength. The passengers clutched their seats, murmurs of fear rising through the cabin. Some prayed softly, others shut their eyes tightly. The air was filled with unease, yet at the window she remained unshaken. Her calm presence was almost strange, as if she had been through far worse and carried a secret confidence no one else had. Her reflection in the glass showed eyes that had once stared into storms at supersonic speed. She had faced skies filled with fire and shadows, where survival was not promised, and yet she had returned. That calm had been forged in those moments, and now it flowed through her quietly, steadying her even when others felt fear. The crew moved quickly through the aisle, their voices carefully reassuring. "Please remain seated. Everything is under control." But she knew from the subtle strain in their faces that they were uneasy too. She could hear the engines fighting the turbulent air, a sound most passengers ignored, but for her it spoke clearly. The storm outside cracked with a sharp flash of lightning, illuminating the cabin for a heartbeat. Gasps followed, but her eyes only narrowed slightly. Watching the dance of the storm, her lips moved again. A whisper carried only to herself, a word, a call sign, a reminder of who she had been high above. The F-22s caught the faint signal once more. The pilots were locked in silence, their instruments glowing, their comms alive with a voice that should not exist in the world of civilians. The wingman spoke finally, his tone almost reverent. "She's out there. She's alive." The leader didn't answer, but his silence carried more than words. The turbulence deepened, shaking the plane hard enough to make trays fall and drinks spill. A frightened child cried out. The passengers were on edge. The woman reached over the aisle and gently placed her hand near the child, her calm presence soothing even without words. The child's crying softened. The mother gave her a grateful look, and the woman only nodded. Her steady gaze returned to the storm. Her memories came unbidden, missions where she had guided her jet through nights far darker than this, voices in her headset, comrades trusting her with their lives. The sound of her call sign repeated over comms as she led them through danger. That life had ended, or so she thought, but the skies tonight whispered otherwise. The captain's voice returned, tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm. We are adjusting course to avoid the worst of the storm." His words tried to hide the tension, but she caught it instantly. Pilots always carried their truth in their tone. She knew what he felt. She knew the storm was pushing them harder than expected. The passengers fidgeted, gripping their armrests. A businessman muttered angrily about delays. Another whispered a prayer. Fear spread in small waves through the cabin, but when eyes turned toward her, they saw no fear, only stillness. Her calm radiated in a way that eased those nearby, though they didn't understand why above. The F-22s shadowed silently. Their pilots were torn. Should they report what they heard? Should they acknowledge the voice? The leader finally said, "If it's her, she doesn't want to be found," his wingman replied. "But she's speaking. She wants us to hear." Inside the cabin, the woman closed her eyes once more, letting the storm rock the plane. Her breathing remained steady. Every vibration of the engines, every shift of the wings, she read it all as though the plane itself was speaking to her. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, not nervously but in rhythm with the turbulence, the way she had once done in cockpits when counting seconds to maneuver. The passengers around her noticed her steady rhythm, her stillness in the storm. It was strange, almost comforting. They didn't know why, but it made them believe the storm would pass. Another crack of thunder rolled through the night. The plane shuddered. Someone gasped loudly. The woman opened her eyes and whispered softly to herself again. A single word, a call sign, her identity rising like smoke from a fire that refused to die. And again above, the F-22 pilots heard it, clear and undeniable. The leader closed his eyes for a brief moment behind his visor. His voice was quiet. "It's her, I don't know how, but it's her," the wingman answered. Then the legends are true. The cabin lights flickered once more and the passengers grew restless. The crew worked harder to keep order, but the woman remained still, calm against the chaos. For her, this storm was only a shadow of the storm she had conquered before, and though the world saw her as just another passenger, the skies above knew better. Tonight, the past and present had collided, and the storm was only the beginning. The storm was finally thinning, but the cabin remained tense. Passengers clung to their armrests as the plane steadied itself through the roughest pockets of air. The crew moved quickly to calm everyone, their practiced smiles doing little to hide their strain. Through it all, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing calm, as if the storm had never touched her. Yet in her chest something stirred. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The skies had always spoken to her in ways others couldn't hear, and tonight they were speaking again. The turbulence wasn't just weather, it was a reminder, a call back to the part of herself she had buried. Her eyes turned upward beyond the cabin ceiling, toward the heavens she could not see. She knew they were there. She could feel them. The fighter jets circling high above, watching silently, listening. She hadn't meant to call out to them, but now that her voice had reached them, she couldn't take it back. The passengers began to relax as the plane steadied. A ripple of relief passed through the cabin, laughter breaking out here and there, the sound of nervous energy being released, but her calm never broke. For her, storms were not measured by shaking seats or flickering lights. They were measured in decisions, in moments where silence could mean survival. Above, the two F-22 pilots stayed close. Their patrol had long since turned into something else. They weren't just guarding the skies anymore. They were guarding her, though she didn't ask for it. Though no one else knew, the leader's voice came low across the comms. "She hasn't said it again," his wingman replied. "But she doesn't need to, we both know." Inside the cabin, the quiet woman adjusted in her seat. Her movements were small, almost unnoticeable, but her mind was alive. She thought of the missions where her call sign had been the only anchor in chaos, where pilots who didn't make it home had spoken her name one last time. The memories were sharp, but they did not wound her. They reminded her of why she had carried that name with such weight. A sudden announcement broke her thoughts. The captain's voice was firm but carried a hint of strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to adjust our altitude." "Nothing to worry about, it's standard procedure." The passengers nodded to themselves, accepting his words, but her eyes narrowed. She knew this wasn't routine. Altitude changes could be ordered for traffic, weather, or security, but the rhythm of his voice told her it was neither weather nor traffic. Something else was happening. Something only a pilot could feel in the tone of another pilot's words. Her gaze shifted back to the window, to the endless dark beyond the wing, and there, for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a shadow against the stars, a movement that didn't belong to clouds. It vanished quickly, but her heart knew what her eyes had caught. They were closer now. The F-22s weren't just patrolling high above anymore. They were watching from nearby, unseen by most eyes, but impossible to hide from hers. She leaned back, closing her eyes, her lips whispering again, barely audible. The call sign, her call sign, a name she had once spoken into the storm without fear. It slipped into the silence of the cabin like a ghost, unheard by the passengers, but not unheard by those who circled above. The F-22 comms came alive instantly. Both pilots stiffened as the word cut through the static. "She said it again," the wingman breathed. The leader answered slowly. "She wants us to know she's here, inside the cabin." No one noticed. A child slept peacefully now. The businessman was snoring, and the crew walked the aisles with the calm of routine. But for her, the quiet was only the surface. Beneath it, the storm of her past swirled. She had never wanted to be remembered. She had left that life behind for a reason. The world of call signs, missions, and skies filled with danger was no longer hers, and yet, when the storm outside had rattled the world, she had fallen back into that identity without thought. She whispered again, softer this time, not for anyone, but for herself, and somewhere above, the jets stayed locked on their path, carrying her name between them like a secret. The lead pilot's voice came once more, steady, certain. "We don't break silence. Not yet, but if it is really her, then tonight isn't just another patrol tonight. We're flying with a legend." And down below, as the cabin quieted, she opened her eyes, looking out at the fading storm. The clouds parted slowly, revealing stars that stretched endless across the night sky. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, calm but unreadable. For the passengers, she was only a quiet woman on a flight. But the skies above already knew her truth. The question was no longer whether she could leave her past behind. The question was when the world would force her to face it again. The storm had cleared, but the air inside the cabin did not relax. Passengers shifted in their seats, still unsettled from the turbulence. Some whispered nervously about delays. Others tried to laugh off their fear. The crew moved with practiced calm, collecting trays and checking seatbelts, but behind their smiles, they too felt the weight of something they couldn't name. At the window, she remained still, her face lit softly by the faint glow of the stars now shining through the cleared sky. Her eyes stayed fixed outside, searching the darkness beyond the wing. She could feel it, she was not alone out there. The presence was too strong to ignore. Above them, the two F-22s held formation, silent, their sleek frames gliding effortlessly through the night. Their pilots had not spoken much since her call sign had broken through their comms again. But the silence was not from confusion. It was from respect, from awe, from something they could not explain. The wingman finally broke the stillness. "We can't just circle her all night. What do we do?" His leader's voice came back firm. "We do what we were trained to do. We watch, we protect, and if the time comes, we answer." On the ground, controllers monitored the radar screens with routine focus. They saw only a civilian flight, nothing unusual. The jets were marked as escort on routine patrol. No one down there heard what the pilots had heard. No one knew that a name whispered into the sky had changed everything. Inside the cabin, a ripple of unease passed when the seatbelt sign flickered on again. The captain's voice followed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated. Air traffic control has instructed us to maintain a lower altitude for the next segment of the flight." His tone was steady, but to her ears there was something hidden in it. Pilots never revealed everything to passengers, but she could hear the edge in his voice. A quiet tension. It wasn't just air traffic control. Something else was unfolding in the sky. She shifted slightly in her seat, her hand brushing against the window. The cool glass beneath her palm grounded her, reminding her she was not in a cockpit anymore. Not gripping controls, not strapped into a harness, yet her instincts remained sharp. Her mind still read the air, the tone, the silence. The man across the aisle noticed her again. He had seen her calm in the storm, and now he couldn't look away. Something about her presence unsettled him and comforted him at the same time. It was as if she carried knowledge none of them could understand. The faintest vibration passed through the plane, something too subtle for most to notice. But her eyes sharpened. She knew the feeling. The jets had moved closer. They were not just patrolling above anymore. They were near, watching more carefully now. Her lips parted and the call sign slipped into the air once more. Soft, steady, like a heartbeat remembered. The passengers around her didn't hear it. But far above, in the cockpits of the F-22s, both pilots froze. "She's calling again," the wingman whispered. His leader answered. "Not calling, reminding. She's letting us know she's still here." For a long moment, no one in the cabin moved. The passengers stayed unaware. The crew moved quietly. The engines hummed steady, but for her, the silence pressed like the weight of memory. She remembered the last mission she had flown, the night when the skies had nearly taken everything. She remembered the voices of her squadron, the urgency, the trust, the way her call sign had echoed through the chaos. It had been the last time she spoke it as a pilot, and now years later it was alive again in the night sky. A faint announcement crackled from the captain. "We've been asked to hold this altitude for longer than expected. Please remain seated, this is nothing unusual." His words were calm, but her instincts told her otherwise. The jets above were not letting go. They were watching, waiting for something. She exhaled slowly. Her reflection in the window looked almost like another person. The quiet passenger the world saw and the fighter pilot the skies remembered. The two halves of her life pressed together in silence. In the F-22 cockpits, the leader spoke softly. "If it's really her, then we're not just flying escort tonight. We're flying in the shadow of someone who carried the sky." His wingman answered with quiet conviction. "Then we hold no matter how long it takes." The stars stretched endless outside. The clouds parted like curtains, and the plane flew steady, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with an invisible weight. The passengers did not know it, but history was flying with them, a hidden story carried in one woman's silence. She leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines fill her ears. The calm face she showed the world never cracked, but inside she knew the truth. The past could not remain buried forever. The sky had called her name again, and sooner or later she would have to answer. The night stretched quiet again. The storm had passed, the turbulence had faded, and most of the passengers were finally beginning to settle into uneasy rest. The cabin lights glowed dimly, casting soft shadows over tired faces. For many, the flight had become ordinary again. But for her, nothing about this night was ordinary. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, calm, unreadable. She touched the glass lightly, her fingers tracing the faint glow of a star outside. She had spent her life chasing stars, flying faster than thought, faster than fear. Her call sign had once carried weight in skies where silence meant death and courage meant survival. And tonight, against her will, that call sign had returned. The passengers around her slept, unaware of what the skies above carried, but she could feel them. The F-22s were still there, close, holding their formation like guardians, their silence pressed against her, demanding recognition, demanding truth in the cockpits. The two pilots remained alert, their eyes locked on the faint outline of the civilian plane. To their instruments, it was nothing more than another flight. But to their ears, to their hearts, it was far more. "She's real," the wingman whispered again. Unable to let go, the leader's voice came steady. "She doesn't want to be seen, but she doesn't want to disappear either." Back inside the cabin, the woman unfastened her belt for the first time since the turbulence. She stood slowly, her movements graceful, unhurried. She walked down the narrow aisle to the small space near the galley. A flight attendant gave her a polite smile, but there was curiosity in her eyes for the first time. Someone had noticed the strange stillness that surrounded her. "Is everything all right?" the attendant asked softly. The woman nodded, her voice calm. "Everything is fine." She returned to her seat, but her presence had left an impression. The attendant lingered for a moment, unable to explain why the quiet passenger felt different, heavier somehow, as if she carried more than luggage with her. She sat again, her gaze lifting back to the window. This time she did not whisper. She spoke clearly, her call sign rolling off her tongue like it had never left. Her voice was low, steady, unbroken. The cabin noise covered it. The passengers heard nothing. But above the clouds, the F-22 comms snapped to life. Both pilots froze. The wingman whispered sharply. "That was it. Clear as day." The leader nodded, silent for a moment, then spoke. "There's no doubt now it's her. The one they told stories about. The one we thought we'd never hear. For a long while." They said nothing more. The jets held their line, their shadows invisible against the night. But inside both cockpits, their hearts raced. They were flying alongside someone who had once defined the skies. Back in the cabin, a passenger stirred across the aisle. The same man who had been watching her since the storm. He leaned slightly, his voice curious. "You weren't afraid, not even once, why?" She turned her head, meeting his gaze directly. Her eyes were calm, but they carried a depth he couldn't explain. "Because the sky has always been my home," she said simply. Her voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. The man blinked, unsure how to respond, sensing more behind her words than he could ever understand. He gave a small nod and leaned back into his seat, unsettled yet strangely reassured. Her attention returned to the window. The stars shimmered outside, endless. The call sign echoed softly in her mind, and she let herself remember fully now. The voices of comrades, the roar of engines, the weight of responsibility. She was no longer just remembering. She was living it again in silence. The leader of the F-22s broke protocol at last, his voice low, almost reverent over the comms. He spoke her call sign back into the sky. The word carried like a salute, like a recognition long overdue. In the cabin, her eyes flicked upward, and for the first time that night, a true smile touched her lips. It was small, almost invisible, but it was real. The skies had answered her. The flight continued on, ordinary for most, but extraordinary for those who knew. The passengers slept. The crew worked quietly, unaware that history had flown with them that night above. The fighters stayed close until the flight path guided them away. Their last act was silent, but it carried meaning. They held formation until the end, as if honoring her one final time. And when dawn broke over the horizon, painting the clouds in gold and crimson, she sat by the window, watching with steady eyes. Her reflection blended with the light, a quiet woman on a passenger plane. But in truth, something far greater. For the world, she was just another traveler. But for the skies, for those who still listened, she was a legend returned, and as the sun rose higher, She whispered her call sign one last time. Not for the passengers, not for the crew, but for herself. And in the silence that followed, it felt as though the sky whispered back,